The uniform I wore meant I had faced the most dangerous terrains in the world, surviving a classified deployment that tested every ounce of my soul. But nothing prepared me for the text waiting when my boots finally touched American soil. It wasn't a welcome home. It was a court summons. The funeral flowers for my beloved grandfather were barely dry, yet my own father was already labeling me a cold-blooded snake and a thief. He dragged me into a federal courtroom, determined to rip away the legacy Grandpa left me, confident that my forced silence would guarantee his victory. He stood before the bench, smiling as he swore I would leave with absolutely nothing. He had no idea the judge was reading the highly classified files I had quietly submitted, documents that turned the tables completely. Watch until the very end to see the exact moment my father's face turned pale. The crisp autumn air bit at my face the moment I stepped off the military transport plane at Travis Air Force Base. I am Amber Vance. I am 28 years old, a lieutenant in the United States Navy, and I had just spent the last 7 months on a highly classified deployment that pushed my mind and body to their absolute limits. My boots finally touched American soil, and all I wanted was to take off my heavy gear, sleep for a week, and properly grieve the loss of my grandfather, Arthur, who had passed away while I was overseas. But a welcoming embrace wasn't waiting for me in the terminal. Instead, as I walked toward the civilian exit carrying my sea bag, a man in a plain gray suit stepped directly into my path. He didn't say, "Welcome home, Lieutenant." He simply looked at my name tape, confirmed my identity, and thrust a thick stack of legal documents into my hands. "You've been served, Lieutenant Vance," he said coldly before turning on his heel and disappearing into the crowd. My hands shook slightly as I ripped open the envelope right there in the middle of the bustling airport. It wasn't a mistake. It was an emergency court summons, filed by my own father, Richard Vance. The funeral flowers for Grandpa Arthur were barely dry, yet my father had already launched a ruthless legal war against me. The paperwork labeled me a cold-blooded snake and a thief, accusing me of manipulating an elderly man to steal the family estate. Standing in the terminal, looking at those malicious words, tears of pure anger stung my eyes. My father didn't know the first thing about the bond I shared with Grandpa Arthur. To me, Grandpa was my hero, a retired naval engineer who spent his life developing breakthrough naval defense tech. When I joined the Navy, our connection grew even deeper. We spoke a language of honor, duty, and sacrifice that my father, Richard, could never comprehend. Richard viewed his own father not as a parent, but as a personal bank account to fund his endless string of failed business ventures and reckless lifestyle. During the final 3 months of Grandpa's life, when his health began rapidly declining, Richard was completely nowhere to be found. He was too busy living large in Las Vegas, dodging creditors and ignoring the hospital's phone calls. I was the one who managed Grandpa's care from thousands of miles away, utilizing every spare moment of my leave to sit by his bedside, holding his hand through the darkest nights. Grandpa wasn't blind to his son's greed. 6 weeks before my classified deployment, he looked me in the eyes and told me he had taken steps to ensure his life's work wouldn't be squandered. He left his entire multi-million-dollar estate and his highly lucrative private tech patents exclusively to me. Richard had assumed he would automatically inherit everything by bloodline. When he discovered the truth, his grief instantly turned into a calculated, venomous rage. I barely had time to unpack my bags at the base transit quarters before my phone flashed with my father's name. I answered. And before I could even say hello, his voice exploded through the speaker, dripping with absolute malice. "You think you're clever, Amber?" he snarled, abandoning any pretense of paternal affection. "You're a cold-blooded snake who whispered lies into a dying man's ear to cut off his own bloodline. You stole my birthright, and I will see you ruined for it." I kept my voice steady, reminding him that Grandpa made his own choices, but Richard just laughed, a dry, chilling sound. "Enjoy your uniform while it lasts, Lieutenant." He sneered. "My lawyers have set a trap you can't escape. We know your recent assignment was highly classified. We know you can't tell the court where you were, what you were doing, or the private security tasks my father assigned you without breaking federal military law. You can't defend yourself without facing a court-martial." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Richard was weaponizing my duty against me. In a standard civil courtroom, my forced silence would make me look evasive, guilty, and entirely absent during Grandpa's final days. He believed my commitment to protecting my country would be the very thing that stripped away my inheritance. He hung up, confident he had backed me into a corner. What he didn't realize was that a naval officer never steps into a battle without an operational strategy. 2 days later, I stood outside the imposing mahogany doors of the federal courthouse, smoothing down the front of my navy dress uniform. Walking inside, the courtroom felt freezing and entirely sterile. My father, Richard, was already seated across the aisle, flanked by a high-priced, aggressive defense attorney who looked at me like I was an easy target. Richard wore a smug, victorious smile, completely convinced that this day would end with my total public humiliation. At the front of the room sat Judge Evelyn Vance, a strict, no-nonsense magistrate whose sharp gaze swept over the room before she called the session to order. Richard's attorney wasted no time, launching into a highly theatrical, venomous opening statement. He painted a picture of me as an absentee, calculated granddaughter who had used my military rank and authority to coerce a vulnerable, elderly man into signing over his life's work just days before I fled the country on a secret assignment. He claimed I was using the cloak of military classification to hide my financial misconduct and evade legal scrutiny. I sat quietly at my table, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression blank, enduring the insults and the blatant character assassination without flinching. I could see the judge listening intently, taking meticulous notes, her face an unreadable mask as the accusations piled up. Richard leaned back in his chair, visibly gloating, believing my absolute silence was the proof of his victory. He had no idea that my silence wasn't fear, it was preparation. As Richard's attorney finally sat down, looking immensely proud of his performance, Judge Vance turned her sharp gaze toward my side of the aisle. "Lieutenant Vance," she said, her voice echoing off the high stone walls, "your father's counsel has made grave accusations. How do you respond?" I didn't flinch. Instead of standing up to argue, I gave a brief nod to the military counsel sitting quietly beside me. He stood up, adjusted his uniform, and stepped forward, carrying a heavy, sealed manila folder stamped with official Department of Defense holographic seals. "Your Honor," my counsel announced firmly, "my client cannot openly testify regarding her recent deployment due to national security. However, under federal statute, we are submitting these heavily encrypted, verified military records directly to this court for an in-camera review." Richard's lawyer jumped up, shouting objections about surprise evidence, but Judge Vance raised her hand, silencing him instantly. She took the folder, broke the government seals, and began reading the contents silently at the bench. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. The arrogant smirks vanished from my father's side of the table, replaced by a thick, suffocating, nervous silence. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting frantically from the judge to his attorney. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the crisp rustling of paper. The documents weren't just standard deployment logs. They contained legally cleared, declassified video entries and ironclad financial tracking authenticated by federal authorities, completely documenting the truth of Grandpa Arthur's final months. When Judge Vance finally raised her head, the calm demeanor she had maintained all morning was completely gone. Her eyes burned with absolute fury, and she directed that piercing, icy glare straight at my father's side of the table. Richard froze, the color draining from his face in an instant. The judge slammed the folder shut, the loud crack echoing through the silent room like a gavel strike. "Mr. Vance," Judge Vance said, her voice dripping with pure disgust. "You came into my courtroom accusing your daughter of manipulation, yet these official, government-verified documents prove an entirely different reality." While Lieutenant Vance was overseas serving her country on a classified mission, she was also coordinating her grandfather's medical care through specialized military channels. More importantly, these records include full documentation from the Judge Advocate General's office, who legally certified Arthur Vance's final will 6 weeks before his passing, confirming his absolute mental competence. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. "But what these files also reveal is your own financial conduct. The Department of Defense tracked multiple unauthorized attempts to access Arthur Vance's private defense tech accounts. I am looking at ironclad proof of systematic forgery, illegal loan applications using frozen assets as collateral, and blatant elder financial abuse committed by you while your father lay dying." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Judge Vance slammed her hand down. "The real fraud isn't her, Mr. Vance. It's you. I am referring this matter to the federal prosecutor immediately." The courtroom transformed into absolute chaos the second the judge finished speaking. Richard's high-priced attorney immediately gathered his papers, whispering frantically to my father before formally requesting to withdraw the lawsuit entirely. But it was far too late for a clean escape. Federal bailiffs stepped up behind Richard, ensuring he couldn't leave the building before the prosecutor's office finalized the paperwork for his impending arrest. He looked over at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and broken pride, realizing that his greed had completely destroyed him. I walked out of that building into the bright afternoon sun, my military honor completely intact, and Grandpa Arthur's legacy safely protected. In the months that followed, Richard faced severe criminal prosecution, leading to massive financial restitution that stripped away his luxury assets. Meanwhile, I stood by my promise to Grandpa. I didn't keep the millions for a lavish lifestyle. Instead, I used the capital and the private tech patents to establish a specialized legal defense foundation dedicated to helping deployed service members protect their homes and families from predatory lawsuits while away on duty. Now, I am deeply curious about all of you who have listened to my journey. What would you do if your own family turned on you the moment you stepped off a grueling deployment? Have you ever witnessed greed tear a family apart like this? Comment below with the city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I am leaving 2 other incredible channel favorite stories on your screen right now that will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching.